Today's episode is brought to you by Ground News, which is something that I wish was around when I first started getting interested in and covering politics. I know it seems like common sense now, but it's really hard to sift through all the news that is out there because the same story can be completely different depending on who and where you're reading it from. That's where Ground News comes in. They give you all the versions of the story right in your feed, left, right, and center. They show you those side by side so you can see how the framing changes and you get a full view of the story. They also have a Blindspot feed that flags stories that are being ignored by one side of the aisle entirely. In a media landscape built to keep you in an echo chamber, Ground News shows you the way out. And right now you can use the link in the description for 40% off. It is their best deal on their best plan. That's the Vantage plan right now. You can only get it from Make It Make Sense. Get access to their Blindspot feed, more than 50,000 unique outlets for news, and one of my favorite features is their Burst Your Bubble newsletter, which helps you break out of that echo chamber and shows you your own media bias for all the things that you consume. I think it is an invaluable resource to expose you to different ideas and help keep your own media diet healthy, because a healthy media diet is just as important as a regular diet. Again, use the exclusive code in the description to get 40% off the Ground News Vantage plan, their absolute best plan right now. The U.S. can't get its story straight on what's happening in Iran. First, the president said the war was over, terminated, finished. He told Congress and the Senate about it. But the Secretary of Defense says actually it's still on a pause. And then the president said we're actually not running a military operation, but a humanitarian one. Except then missiles were fired and he called it a mini-war and then promised to wipe out Iran again. So is this war over or not? And why is this like the third time that I've had to ask that question? I'm going to explain all of that today. It's Tuesday, May 5th, 2026. I'm Grant Hermes, and this is Make It Make Sense. Before we get to what happened today and yesterday, we have to talk about what happened last week. On Friday of last week, the president sent letters to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and the President of the Senate, Iowa's Chuck Grassley, saying that the war in Iran was over. Specifically, he said it was terminated. He said that because Iran and the U.S. are in the middle of an indefinite 2-week ceasefire, and because no one has exchanged fire since that started on April 7th, he said the war was over. Here's the thing. That's not true. On April 19th, a U.S. destroyer fired into the engine room of an Iranian ship trying to make it through the Strait of Hormuz, which both the U.S. and Iran have blocked off right now. And then U.S. Marines boarded that ship to take it over. Now, somehow that didn't break the ceasefire, but it definitely feels like a commence fire rather than a ceasefire. Anyway, the reason Trump sent that letter to Congress and the Senate was because the clock had run out on the War Powers Act, the law that the White House was using to getting the U.S. into the war in the first place. Now, that law, which has been in place since the 1970s, gives the president 60 days to carry out a military operation before Congress has to either declare war or give the president what's called an authorized use of military force, or an AUMF. Congress hasn't technically declared war since World War II, and the last two AUMFs were approved in 2001 for the War on Terror and 2002 for the war in Iraq. Now, presidents since 2001 have used that 01 AUMF to cover all manner of things. Among the most controversial was Obama's use of it for drone strikes in the Middle East, but none of those things would really cover what's happening here in Iran. So Trump had to declare this war over by the 60-day deadline or basically be actively involved in an outright illegal war. Now, you've heard experts on this show, including Yale law professor Una Hathaway, say this war was already illegal, but carrying out a war without any hint of approval or legal backing would be like extra illegal. Now, that leaves this little problem of the fact that we are still running a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, preventing 20% of the world's oil from leaving the Middle East, among a lot of other things. That has spiked prices and tanked stocks, and that's something we'll get into a little bit later. Now, That blockade looks an awful lot like a military operation, and we are still sending tons of military planes to the Middle East, but the president just said we weren't in a war, so what is the White House to do? Well, on Sunday, the president announced on Truth Social in a very long post a new operation, one that he's calling Project Freedom, saying it's a humanitarian project and that U.S. forces will guide ships safely out of these restricted waterways so that they can freely and ably get on with their business. On paper, that sounds like we're doing something totally new, like we are leading oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, through the mines that are still in the water, the ones the Pentagon has been telling Congress that we won't be able to remove until at least November at the earliest. Well, in reality, that's not happening. What's really happening is more like U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, which oversees U.S. armed forces in the Middle East, is just calling these ships and shipping companies to convince them it's safe to go through the strait. And it sounds like maybe give them GPS directions to hopefully miss the mines, although they're coming awfully close. The head of CENTCOM said in a statement, quote, "We've reached out to dozens of ships and shipping companies to encourage traffic flow," which feels less like a guarantee of safety from the U.S. Navy and more like what you tell your boss when you haven't really done your job, you've just sent a lot of emails. Now, as of when I'm recording this, CENTCOM has said it has successfully guided 2 ships through the strait, but online trackers for the strait show that it's at least 11 ships that have gone through in the last 24 hours, or about 20% the normal level. In contrast to that, CENTCOM is saying that 51 ships have been told to turn around and not leave the strait by U.S. forces. So is that a humanitarian mission or is it a military blockade? If it's the latter, that would really seem like either the president needs to declare a new war under the War Powers Act or go to Congress to get permission to use the military. But there's a little hiccup there. Congress isn't back in D.C. for another week, but we are not going to get into that trap today. Because despite the fact that the war was terminated, Iran says it struck 2 U.S. warships in the Strait of Hormuz yesterday, and the U.S. says in return it sank 6 smaller Iranian missile boats, leaving behind the fact that the Pentagon and the president have been saying for weeks now the Iranian Navy was destroyed. The president actively posted about it yesterday. Shooting at each other definitely feels like either a continuation of the old war or a start of a new conflict. And during an event for small businesses at the White House yesterday, the president even said the U.S. was still in a war, completely undermining the letter he sent to legislative leaders.
Our country's booming now, despite the fact that we're in I call it a mini-war, because that's all they are.
Now, I know that Trump isn't exactly a wordsmith, but he's using the present tense there. He's saying we're in a mini-war, not we were in a mini-war. So when he told the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate that the war was terminated, that apparently isn't true because he doesn't even believe it now. That alone should be enough to prompt Congress to call itself back into session. But again, I promised we wouldn't get caught in the congressional quicksand here, and I'm going to do my best not to do that today, I promise. All of this got more confusing this morning when the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, who's basically the head of the heads of the military who reports to the president, well, they held a press conference about where things were at. And General Kane said Iran had attacked U.S. ships more than 10 times. But that wasn't enough to be considered a conflict. And Secretary Hegseth said the ceasefire was still intact.
Thank you, Secretary Hegseth. Last 24 hours or so, Iran's fired at us. We fired at Iran. Just going to ask you more directly, is the ceasefire over?
No, the ceasefire is not over. Ultimately, this is a separate and distinct project. And we expected there would be some churn at the beginning, which happened. And we said we would defend aggressively, and we absolutely have. Iran knows that.
Now, if you're asking yourself how a ceasefire isn't over after firing has ceasing, your guess is as good as mine. If you're asking how do you still have a ceasefire in a war that was supposed to be over, the answer is the ceasefire is between Iran and the U.S., and declaring the war over is between the president, Congress, and maybe articles of impeachment. The only thing is that doesn't line up with what Trump had said just a day before during that event about the U.S. being in a war and what he told Fox News just hours before Hegseth took the podium.
He talked about Project Freedom and the U.S. efforts to guide vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, issuing a new warning to the Iranian regime, saying if the Iranians try to target U.S. ships in this area, they will be, quote, blown off the face of the earth.
So that reporting does not sound like a president who is trying to operate in a ceasefire. It's also another threat that could be interpreted on a national stage as a potential use of nuclear weapons and a potential genocidal threat, which would make it a war crime. And given Trump's past insistence on targeting civilian infrastructure like bridges and power plants, those kinds of threats are being taken seriously around the world. And increasingly, Trump is getting frustrated with the war. Axios is reporting this morning that Trump is looking to take action. A senior U.S. official saying he doesn't want to sit still, he wants pressure, he wants a deal. And the interesting thing here is that pressure was the whole point of this entire thing in the first place. The bombings, the threats, the blockade, all of it was supposed to be maximum pressure on Iran. There's not a lot left the U.S. could do here to put more pressure on Iran, except for more military strikes. But that would certainly be a violation of the ceasefire and the start of a new war and maybe a new war powers timeline. And it might just happen. CNN is now reporting the U.S. and Israel are coordinating on the potential for more strikes inside Iran. To hit what? We don't know. We've been told that everything has been decimated. The United Arab Emirates have been telling various outlets that the strikes could take place within the next day or so, but no one knows that either. And it could just be the UAE trying to goad the U.S. back into the conflict after Iran fired missiles on a key oil depot there where a fire broke out, even though the missiles were reportedly intercepted. And if what Hegseth said is how the administration is thinking about this whole thing, which is to say a separate and distinct project, well, then the White House could potentially just declare a new conflict under the War Powers Act, giving the president another 2 months of free rein to conduct a war. That has left a lot up in the air here. And while starting the week with attacks on the straits and oil prices soaring and stocks falling, reassurance today that the ceasefire is still in place, then oil prices fell a little bit to about $100 a barrel, and stocks rebounded just a little bit as well. Now, none of that will mean anything for the rest of us for at least a month. Oil prices now matter for contracts that will hit what we pay at the gas pump in June. That means last month, when oil was at record prices, well, those prices are hitting gas stations now, and it is taking its toll. The average national gas price just hit $4.50 a gallon, something we haven't seen since the height of the pandemic, which I think is important to point out because you hear that a lot. I know that I've said it before. The reason it matters isn't just because it gives you a sense of time here, but because it's important to point out the context. The pandemic was unforeseeable, and it was global, and it was a massive supply chain shock. The world was forced to shut down. The prices that we're seeing now were caused because of a war that the U.S. volunteered to enter without input from Congress and without any real public support or what seems to be a real vision for what would happen if this thing dragged on. Parts of California right now are hitting a record high of $7 for a gallon of gas. And even in oil country, in like the mid-southern states, Oklahoma and Texas, they're nearing the $4 a gallon mark, something that most of those folks there have never seen in their entire lives. Right now, experts think that could hold through July if things stay the same in Iran. And we're also beginning to see the cost of fuel overall hit the job market. 1 in 6 workers said they've switched to working from home because the cost to fill up their tanks for their commute has become too expensive, according to a new poll from the auto magazine American Muscle. And I know it's not exactly the normal stellar polling place I usually use, but I looked into the methodology in this one and the numbers here, and they look good. Otherwise, I wouldn't be telling you about it. That same poll found that 73% of Americans are cutting back on spending in some way because of gas prices. 45% said they were cutting back on travel and vacations, so there goes your summer. 43% said they were cutting back on shopping. We're talking Christmas gifts and shopping season just around the corner. They said the same thing about eating out and dining out. About a third said they were cutting back on entertainment. We are entering into movie blockbuster season here, and almost 20% said they were going to have to cut back on groceries and essentials. And to make matters worse, we were already well past the price mark of $4.42 a gallon, where people said they'd start making major changes to their routines. And in states like California, we are dangerously close to the price where people said they'd stop driving altogether, right around $7.08 a gallon. At this point, 96% of Americans see gas prices as a burden on their finances. And CNN is now looking for people to talk to who are looking to switch their jobs because they can't afford to drive to their current one. That is not a story you do if things are going well. And finally here, the American appetite for more fighting in Iran is as low as our most unpopular wars. It's as unpopular as the Iraq War, at the worst of the fighting then in 2006, and at the height of the anti-war movement and images of dead soldiers on the evening news during the Vietnam War. This latest poll is from the Washington Post and ABC, and said that 61% of Americans think that getting into the war in Iran was a mistake, and 48% think the U.S. should cut a deal to end it, even if that deal is worse for the U.S. Now, 46% said the U.S. should push for a better deal, even if it meant continuing to fight, so we're pretty divided on that. The issue is, with all of this, the president doesn't seem to believe it. A few months ago, I talked about how White House staff was only giving Trump polls that showed he had a 99 or 95% approval ratings. They just weren't telling him it was only with the most MAGA of MAGA supporters. But it kept him happy, which meant everyone kept their jobs. It also meant that he thought everything he was doing was working. The point of not sugarcoating things to the president is so that he can course correct when he needs to, so that he could be an effective leader for the people who put him in office and for the rest of America. So recently, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles has started telling staff to put actual polls in front of Trump. Here's what he had to say about that yesterday.
You win all 7 swing states when you get only bad press. It's fake press. They give me fake polls. They tell me about polls and this. You know, it's interesting. They did a poll on the war with Iran, and they said only 32% of the people like it. Well, I don't like it, and I don't like war at all, but we're equipped better than it. We have the greatest military in the world. You saw what happened with Venezuela. You see what happens with everything. But they said 32% of the people are against President Trump. Well, when you explain it, like, is it okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon? It wouldn't be 32%. But even if you said that, there'd be a 32% because the polls are fake. I mean, they're totally fake.
So what you've got is a president who doesn't believe his own staff, says the polls are bad because the White House isn't explaining his position well enough, and even then, he wouldn't believe the polling if they could explain things. That's not a recipe for success here as much as it's more of what we've got, a confusing conflict that doesn't seem to have an end in sight. All right. That is it for today's show. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, like and subscribe. Become a paid subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where this week's Things You Forgot from Civics class is about redistricting. In the wake of last week's major Supreme Court case, it felt like it was a good time to go over how redrawing the lines for congressional districts is supposed to work and how it works in states around the country, so you know how crazy it's about to get. And as always, share the show on social media. It is Mims News Pod. You can tag me at Grant Hermes on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Hermes on everything else. Thank you so much for watching today. I'm Grant Hermes, and I'll talk to you next time.